I never thought I'd be writing this story, but after what happened 3 weeks ago, I can't get it out of my head. I'm 47 now, and for the past 29 years, I've been living with the weight of an accusation that destroyed everything I thought I knew about family and truth. Back in 1996, I was 18 and had just graduated from high school. My parents divorced when I was 12, and my dad remarried this woman named Patricia when I was 16. Patricia never liked me much, always made snide comments about how I looked like my mother or how I was too much like her. My dad, being the conflict avoidant person he was, never really stood up for me, but I figured it was just normal step parent stuff and I'd be out of the house soon enough for college. My cousin Sarah was 16 at the time, and she was like a little sister to me growing up. Our families were close, and she'd often come to stay at our house during summers or weekends. She was going through a rough patch that year, acting out at school and getting into fights with her parents, the usual teenage rebellion stuff. I actually tried to be there for her, thinking maybe she needed someone to talk to who wasn't her parents. That summer, Sarah was staying with us for about 2 weeks while her parents went on their anniversary trip. Everything seemed normal at first. We'd watch movies, I'd help her with some summer reading assignments. Typical cousin stuff. But I started noticing Patricia having these weird private conversations with Sarah, always stopping when I walked into the room. I didn't think much of it at the time, figured it was just women talk or something. Then one night in July, all hell broke loose. I was in my room playing video games when I heard Sarah crying downstairs. I went to check on her and she was sitting on the couch with Patricia and my dad. The moment I walked in, Sarah looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like she was terrified of me. Patricia immediately stood up and told me to stay back, that Sarah had something to tell my father. What came next still makes my stomach drop. Sarah, through tears, told my dad that I had been touching her inappropriately, that I had tried to force myself on her earlier that day when Patricia was at the grocery store. She said I had been doing things to her for months whenever she stayed over, and she was finally brave enough to speak up. I was completely frozen. I couldn't even form words. Here was this kid I'd practically helped raise, telling my father that I was some kind of predator. My dad's face went through about 10 different emotions in 5 seconds. Patricia was immediately comforting Sarah, telling her how brave she was for speaking up and how sorry she was that this had happened under her roof. When I finally found my voice, I denied everything. I begged my dad to believe me, told him Sarah was lying, that I had never touched her or any girl inappropriately in my life. But the damage was done. Patricia was already talking about calling the police, about getting Sarah to a hospital, about how they needed to protect her from me. My dad asked me to leave the house that night, just like that. No investigation, no question, no benefit of the doubt. He gave me some cash and told me to go stay at a motel until we could figure things out. I remember driving to that dingy motel on Route 9, sitting in the parking lot for hours, trying to understand how my life had just imploded in the span of 20 minutes. The next few days were a blur. Patricia did call the police, and I had to go in for questioning. The detective was actually pretty thorough, asked me a lot of questions about my relationship with Sarah, about that day, about our family dynamics. I told him the truth about everything, including how Patricia had never liked me and how she'd been having private conversations with Sarah. I even mentioned that I thought it was weird how Patricia was so quick to call the police instead of talking to me first. Sarah had to be interviewed too, and apparently her story had some inconsistencies. She couldn't remember specific dates. Her timeline was off. And when they asked her detailed questions about what allegedly happened, she got flustered and kept changing small details. The detective told me later that these inconsistencies, combined with no physical evidence and no witnesses, meant they couldn't move forward with charges. But he also said that didn't mean anything happened, just that they couldn't prove it in court. Even without criminal charges, the damage to my family was irreversible. My dad's side of the family completely cut me off. My aunts and uncles, who had known me since I was born, suddenly treated me like I was dangerous. Family gatherings that I wasn't invited to, cousins who wouldn't return my calls, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. My mom believed me, thank God, but she was dealing with her own guilt about the divorce and whether she should have fought harder for custody. She helped me get into a community college in another state, and I basically started over. New town, new people, new life. I threw myself into my studies, worked part-time jobs, and tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. College was actually good for me. I met people who knew nothing about my past, my friends, and even had a few relationships. But I was always paranoid about getting too close to anyone's family. Always worried that somehow my past would catch up with me. I ended up getting a degree in computer science, got a decent job, eventually met my wife Jennifer when I was 28. I told Jennifer everything before we got married. She was the first person besides my mom who completely believed me without question. She said she could see in my eyes that I was telling the truth, and that anyone who knew me could see I wasn't capable of what I'd been accused of. We've been married for 17 years now, have 2 kids, and I've built a good life despite everything. But I never stopped wondering about Sarah. Part of me hoped she'd eventually come forward and tell the truth. But another part of me was terrified that she'd stick to her story forever. I kept tabs on her through social media over the years, saw that she got married, had kids, seemed to have a normal life. It ate at me sometimes, knowing that she was living her life while I was still dealing with the consequences of her lie. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from my uncle, Sarah's dad. We hadn't spoken in probably 15 years, so I was shocked to even see his number on my phone. He sounded terrible. Told me that Sarah had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months ago and that she was in hospice care. He said she'd been asking for me, that she wanted to see me before she died. I didn't know what to think. Jennifer and I talked about it for days. Part of me wanted to tell him to go to hell, that Sarah had made her choice 29 years ago and now she could live with it. But another part of me was curious, maybe hopeful that she wanted to finally tell the truth. I decided to go. Jennifer came with me for support, and we drove 6 hours to the small town where Sarah's family still lived. The hospice facility was nicer than I expected. When we got to Sarah's room, it was packed with family members, people I hadn't seen in decades, all looking at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Sarah looked terrible. The cancer had ravaged her body, and she was barely recognizable as the 16-year-old girl who had destroyed my life. But her eyes were still the same, and when she saw me, she started crying immediately. What happened next was something I never could have prepared for. Sarah asked everyone to sit down, said she had something important to tell all of us. Her voice was weak, but she was determined to get the words out. She told everyone that she had lied about me, that I had never touched her, never done anything inappropriate, never hurt her in any way. She said she had made up the entire story because Patricia had offered her $500 to get me kicked out of the house. Patricia had convinced her that my dad loved me more than he loved his new wife, and that as long as I was around, Patricia would never feel like she truly belonged in the family. The room was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Sarah went on to explain that Patricia had coached her on what to say, had helped her come up with details that would make the story believable. She said Patricia had promised her that nothing serious would happen to me, that I just have to move out and eventually everyone would forget about it. But Sarah said she realized pretty quickly that it wasn't going to just blow over. She watched as I was cut off from the family, saw how it destroyed my relationship with my dad, heard whispers about me at family gatherings for years. She said she wanted to come clean so many times, but Patricia had threatened to tell everyone that Sarah was a liar who ruined an innocent person's life, and Sarah was terrified of the consequences. The worst part was learning that Patricia had been holding this over Sarah's head for almost 30 years. Whenever Sarah wanted to tell the truth, Patricia would remind her that she'd be destroying her own reputation, that people would never trust her again, that she'd be known as the girl who falsely accused her cousin of sexual assault. As Sarah was telling this story, I kept looking round the room at my family members. My dad was sitting there with his mouth open, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. My aunts and uncles were staring at me with expressions of horror and shame. Some of them were crying. Sarah finished by apologizing to me directly. She said she knew sorry wasn't enough, that she had stolen 29 years of my life and my relationship with my family. She said she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive her, not for her sake, but so I could find peace. I honestly don't remember what I said to her. I think I just nodded and told her I appreciated her telling the truth. The whole thing was so surreal that I felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. Sarah died 4 days later. I didn't go to the funeral. Since then, my phone has been ringing non-stop. Family members who haven't spoken to me in 3 decades are calling to apologize, to try to explain why they believe the accusation, to ask if we can rebuild our relationship. My dad has called me probably 15 times crying and begging me to forgive him. The thing is, I don't know how I feel about any of this. Part of me is relieved that the truth finally came out, that I was vindicated after all these years, but another part of me is furious that it took Sarah dying for her to finally do the right thing. And I'm especially angry that Patricia never faced any consequences for what she did. I've been thinking about this constantly for the past 3 weeks. Do I try to rebuild relationships with family members who abandoned me based on a lie? Do I forgive my dad for choosing his wife over his son? Do I pursue some kind of legal action against Patricia, even though I don't know if there's anything I can actually do after all this time? I guess what I'm really asking is, how do you move forward from something like this? How do you process 29 years of injustice and suddenly being told that everyone knows you were innocent all along? Am I wrong for not immediately welcoming these family members back into my life with open arms? I built a good life without them, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that always wanted my family back. Now that it's possible, I don't know if I actually want it anymore. Does that make me a bad person? Update 1. I wasn't sure I was going to post an update, but a lot of people reached out with support and advice after my original post. And I figured I owed it to you all to let you know how things are going. First off, thank you to everyone who took time to respond. I read every single comment, and while some of them were hard to read, they all helped me process what I'm going through. A lot of you suggested therapy, which I've been thinking about for years but never actually did. I called around yesterday, found a therapist who specializes in family trauma, and I have my first appointment next week. The past 3 days have been a whirlwind. My dad has been calling me every day, sometimes multiple times a day. He's desperate to talk, to figure out how we can move forward, and honestly, it's been overwhelming. I told him yesterday that I need him to give me some space while I process everything, and he seemed to understand. He said he's been going to counseling too, trying to work through his own guilt and figure out how he let things get so bad. I've also been hearing from other family members, my cousin Jake, whose uncle Mike's oldest son called me yesterday. He's about my age and we used to be really close when we were kids. He said that he'd always had doubts about Sarah's story, but he'd been too afraid to voice them at the time. He said that everyone in the family had been walking on eggshells around the whole situation for years, and that he was relieved that the truth was finally out. Jake told me something that really hit me hard. He said that Sarah had tried to tell him the truth about 5 years ago when she first got diagnosed with cancer. She'd been drunk at a family gathering and had pulled him aside, crying and saying that she'd done something terrible to me. But when he tried to get her to explain what she meant, she'd gotten scared and claimed she was just upset about her diagnosis. He said he'd always wondered if there was some more to the story, but that he hadn't known how to bring it up without potentially making things worse. The thing that's been eating at me is that apparently I wasn't the only one who suffered because of Patricia's manipulation. Jake told me that she'd been spreading poison about other family members for years, always trying to turn people against each other. She'd convinced my dad that Uncle Mike was jealous of his success and was trying to sabotage his business. She told lies about various cousins and their spouses, always creating drama and division. Sarah's lie about me was just the most extreme example of a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years. Learning this has made me even angrier, if that's possible. It's one thing to know that Patricia destroyed my life out of jealousy and spite. It's another thing to know that she was systematically trying to destroy my entire extended family. And the worst part is that she was so good at it that nobody realized what she was doing until it was too late. I've been trying to figure out how to handle anger I'm feeling. Some of you suggested I should just focus on moving forward, not waste my energy on being angry about the past, but I don't think I can just flip a switch and stop being angry. I lost 29 years of my life. I lost my relationship with my father, my extended family, and my chance at a normal young adulthood. I lost my opportunity to go to college, to build the career I dreamed of, to have the kind of life I'd always wanted. I know that holding on to anger isn't healthy, and I know that it's not going to change what happened, but I also think I have a right to be angry. What Patricia did was evil, and the fact that she never faced consequences for it makes me sick. I keep thinking about how satisfied she must have felt when her plan worked. How she must have enjoyed watching me get kicked out of the family. Makes me want to scream. On the other hand, I've been thinking a lot about Sarah and what she must have gone through. She was just a kid when Patricia manipulated her, and she spent the rest of her life living with the consequences of the manipulation. She died feeling guilty and ashamed, and that breaks my heart. I keep wondering if there's something I could have done differently, some way I could have fought harder to clear my name that might have made it easier for her to tell the truth sooner. I've been going through some old photos and letters from before everything happened, trying to remember what my life was like when I was 18. It's painful to look at pictures of myself from that time, to see how young and hopeful I was. I had so many plans, so many dreams. I was going to study business and take over my dad's company. Maybe get married, have kids of my own. I was going to be somebody. Instead, I've spent the last 29 years just surviving. I've had a few jobs I didn't hate, a few relationships that lasted a couple of years, a few friends who I see occasionally, But I've never really lived. I've never taken risks or pursued dreams or allowed myself to be vulnerable with anyone. I've just been going through the motions, waiting for something to change. Now that the truth is out, I don't know how to start living again. I don't know how to trust people or how to believe that good things can happen to me. I don't know how to stop being the person that Patricia's lie turned me into and start being the person I might have been if none of this had happened. My dad keeps talking about making up for lost time, about trying to have a relationship again. But I don't know if that's possible. Even putting aside the fact that he believed I was capable of assaulting a child, even putting aside the fact that he chose Patricia over me, there's still the question of what we would even talk about. We're strangers now. We don't know each other at all. I keep thinking about this quote I heard once. The truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off. I guess that's where I am right now. I'm free from the lie that's been defining my life for 29 years. But I'm also angrier than I've ever been. I don't know how to move from the anger to the freedom part. I'll probably post another update in a few days after I've had my first therapy session. Maybe talking to a professional will help me figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life. Update 2. Things have taken a pretty dramatic turn since my last update. I did end up consulting with a lawyer about Patricia. And while he said criminal charges would be nearly impossible after all this time, he thought I might have a case for a civil lawsuit. The statute of limitations for intentional infliction of emotional distress in our state is pretty long, and given the severity of what happened, he thought it was worth exploring. But before I could decide whether to pursue that, something unexpected happened. Patricia showed up at my house 3 days ago. I was working from home when the doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, there she was. She looked terrible, like she'd aged 10 years in the past month. She was crying before she even started talking. She begged me to let her explain, said she'd been driving around for hours, working up the courage to come to my door. Against my better judgment, I let her in. Jennifer was at work, so it was just the two of us. Patricia broke down completely. She told me that she'd been eaten alive by guilt for 29 years, that she'd never intended for things to go as far as they did. She said when she first approached Sarah about lying, she genuinely thought it would just result in me moving out, maybe going to stay with my mom for a while. She never anticipated that my dad would cut me off completely or that the rest of the family would turn their backs on me. She said she tried to convince my dad to reconcile with me multiple times over the years. But every time she brought it up, he'd get angry and say that he couldn't risk having a predator around his family. She said she realized she'd created a monster that she couldn't control. The most shocking part was when she told me she'd been sending Sarah money every year on the anniversary of the accusation. Not because Sarah was blackmailing her, but because Patricia felt guilty about what she'd put Sarah through. She said Sarah had been struggling with depression and anxiety for years, and Patricia always wondered if it was connected to the lies she'd forced Sarah to tell. Patricia begged me to forgive her, said she knew she didn't deserve it, but that she couldn't live with herself anymore. She offered to pay for therapy, to help me with legal fees if I wanted to sue her. Anything to try to make amends. I honestly didn't know what to say. Here was this woman who had destroyed my life, sitting in my living room crying, asking for forgiveness. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her exactly what her actions had cost me. But another part of me just felt sorry for her. I told her I needed time to think about everything she'd said. She gave me her contact information and left. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to pursue any legal action against her. On one hand, I want her to face the consequences of what she did. On the other hand, I'm not sure dragging this through the courts is going to help me heal. The strangest part of all this is that I'm starting to feel like I can actually move forward for the first time in 29 years. Knowing the truth, having it acknowledged by everyone involved, has lifted a weight off my shoulders that I didn't even realize I was carrying. Update 3. I'm writing this final update because I think I finally reached some kind of resolution with this whole situation. It's been about 3 weeks since Patricia came to my house, and I've made some decisions about how I want to handle everything moving forward. First, I decided not to pursue legal action against Patricia. After talking with Jennifer and my therapist, I realized that going through a lawsuit would just keep me tied to this situation for years. And I want to focus on moving forward rather than looking backwards. Patricia has been true to her word about paying for therapy. She's also set up a fund for my kids' college expenses. It's not about the money, but I do think it shows that she's genuinely trying to make amends. I've also slowly been rebuilding relationships with some family members. I had dinner with my aunt and uncle last week. We talked for hours about everything that happened. They were both incredibly apologetic and didn't try to make excuses for their behavior. We're not back to where we were before, and maybe we never will be, but we're building something new. The biggest development is with my dad. He's been in therapy since Patricia left. His therapist suggested we try a mediated conversation with a neutral third party present. We met with a family counselor yesterday. For the first time in 29 years, my dad and I had an honest conversation about what happened. He told me that he's been haunted by his decision to kick me out that night. He said he was so shocked by the accusation that he didn't know how to process it. And Patricia was so convincing about needing to protect Sarah that he felt like he had no choice. He also admitted he'd been struggling with his own demons around that time, dealing with guilt about his divorce from my mom, trying to make his new marriage work. None of that excuses what he did, but it helped me understand his mindset a little better. He broke down crying when he told me how much he'd missed me over the years. How many times he'd picked up the phone to call me but couldn't bring himself to do it because he was convinced I hated him. I told him I didn't hate him, but that I was deeply hurt by his decision to believe Patricia and Sarah over me. I explained how his rejection had affected every relationship I'd had since then. How I'd struggled to trust people and form deep connections because the most important person in my life had abandoned me when I needed him most. We're not magically fixed, but we're talking now. He's asked if he can meet Jennifer and the kids, and I think I'm ready for that. It's weird thinking about my dad having a relationship with his grandchildren after all this time, but I want to try. The most unexpected outcome of all this is that I've been in touch with some of Sarah's friends from high school. Word has gotten around about what really happened, and several people have reached out to me. Turns out that Sarah had confided in a few close friends over the years about what she'd done, and they've been encouraging her to come forward. One of them told me that Sarah had been planning to tell the truth, even before she got sick, that she'd been working up the courage to call me. I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse about everything. On one hand, I'm glad Sarah wasn't planning to take the secret to her grave. On the other hand, it's still painful to think about how different things might have been if she'd been brave enough to tell the truth years ago. I guess what I've learned from all this is that forgiveness isn't really about the other person. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger and resentment. I'm choosing to forgive Patricia and Sarah and my dad, not because they deserve it, but because carrying that hatred around for the rest of my life isn't going to serve me or my family. I'm also learning that you can forgive someone without forgetting what they did. And you can rebuild a relationship without pretending that the past didn't happen. My relationships with my family will never be the same as they were before, but maybe they can be something different and meaningful in their own way. Thanks to everyone who read my story and offered support. It helped more than you know to have strangers believe me and validate what I went through. For anyone else dealing with false accusations or family betrayal, I guess my advice is to focus on building a life that makes you happy, regardless of what other people think or do. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, but you can't wait for that to happen before you start living your life. I'm going to keep moving forward, one day at a time. Stay tuned for more stories from Our Girl Relationships.